The house stood on the edge of town, nestled between tall trees and endless fields. It was a modest home, not too big, not too small, just enough for one man and the life he had built around solitude. Inside, everything was in perfect order. The books on the shelves sat untouched, a layer of dust forming on their spines. The kitchen counter remained spotless, void of any mess that might come from a family's morning rush. The air was thick with the kind of silence that settled deep into the walls, a silence that spoke of an absence rather than peace. James sat by the window, staring out at the fading evening light. His fingers traced the rim of his coffee mug, now half empty and cold. He wasn't always like this, alone. Once, laughter had filled this space, voices had echoed off these very walls, and warmth had spread through every room. But time had a cruel way of taking more than it gave. Years passed, friends moved on, and family became distant memories. Now, the only sound that ever interrupted the quiet was the occasional whistle of the wind through the trees and the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Loneliness wasn't something James had chosen, it had crept in, slow and insidious, like a fog rolling over the hills. At first, he welcomed it, treating solitude as a companion rather than an enemy. It gave him time to think, to work, to exist without distraction. But as the months turned into years, he started to feel the weight of it, pressing down on his chest in the long, sleepless nights. He found himself lingering at the park longer than necessary, watching families play with their pets, laughter spilling into the air like music. He told himself he didn't need anyone, but deep down, he longed for something, someone, to break the monotony of his quiet life. One evening, as he walked home from work, he passed by the small animal shelter at the corner of the street. A flickering light from inside caught his eye, and through the glass, he saw rows of cages lined up against the walls, each holding a soul waiting for a second chance. He hadn't planned to stop, but his feet carried him inside before his mind could protest. The scent of hay, food, and something faintly medicinal filled the air. The sound of soft whimpers and meows surrounded him, each one a plea for love, for a home. A kind-faced woman at the counter greeted him, her eyes lighting up when he asked about adoption. She led him through the aisles, past eager tails wagging and wide eyes filled with hope. Then he saw them. A golden retriever sat in the corner, his head resting on his paws, eyes reflecting something James recognized all too well, loneliness. Unlike the other dogs who jumped against their cages, tails wagging in excitement, this one simply watched, quiet and patient, as if he had long accepted that no one would come for him. His fur was slightly unkempt, a few scars visible along his side, and yet there was a quiet dignity about him, a silent plea that didn't need words. James crouched down. "Hey there, buddy." The dog's ears perked up, but he didn't move at first, studying James as if trying to decide if he was worth trusting. After a moment, he took a tentative step forward, nudging his nose against James' hand. It was enough. "This one," James said, turning to the woman. She smiled. "His name's Max, he's been here for months. Sweetest boy, just waiting for the right person." James nodded, already feeling something stir in his chest. But before he could sign the papers, a soft sound caught his attention, a sharp but delicate meow. He turned his head and found a pair of emerald green eyes staring at him through the bars of a nearby cage. A sleek black cat sat perfectly poised, tail curled around her paws, as if judging the entire world before her. She didn't move, didn't beg for attention, only tilted her head slightly, regarding him with the same quiet observation that Max had. "She's beautiful," James murmured. The woman chuckled. "That's Luna. She's clever, independent, likes to do things on her own terms. But she's got a good heart, once you earn her trust." James glanced at Max, then back at Luna. Two souls, both waiting, both watching, both different yet strangely similar in their quiet longing. He hadn't planned on adopting one pet, let alone two. But something deep inside told him they belonged together, not just with each other, but with him. Can I take them both? The woman's face lit up. Absolutely. Signing the papers felt like a shift in the air, like the first crack in the walls he had built around himself. The silence that had once been his only companion was about to change forever. The ride home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet, one filled with anticipation rather than emptiness. Max lay curled up in the back seat, watching James with soft eyes, while Luna sat perched on the passenger seat, her gaze fixed on the road ahead, as if she were already planning her place in this new life. When they arrived home, James opened the door and hesitated for a moment. For years, this house had been a space only for him, filled with nothing but the echoes of his own thoughts. But as Max padded inside, sniffing curiously, and Luna leaped onto the windowsill, her tail swaying in slow contemplation, the house suddenly felt different. Warmer. Alive. James set down their bowls, watching as they cautiously explored their new home. Max sniffed every corner, his tail beginning to wag slightly as he grew comfortable. Luna, ever the observer, jumped onto the couch, curling up as if she had always belonged there. James let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He had expected to bring them home, feed them, and care for them. What he hadn't expected was how quickly the loneliness in his chest started to ease. That night, as James lay in bed, he heard the soft padding of paws on the wooden floor. A moment later, Max jumped up onto the bed, curling at his feet. Not long after, he felt the light weight of Luna as she settled near his pillow, her warm fur brushing against his arm. For the first time in years, the silence in his home wasn't empty, it was full. Full of steady breathing, soft warmth, and the quiet understanding of three souls who had found each other. James closed his eyes, a small smile forming on his lips. He was no longer alone. And somehow, he knew, this was just the beginning. James woke up the next morning to an unfamiliar warmth near his feet. For a moment, he was confused. He had spent years sleeping alone, the bed always feeling far too big for just one person. But now, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, he glanced down to see Max curled up at the foot of the bed, his chest rising and falling in a slow, peaceful rhythm. And then, he felt it, something soft brushing against his arm. Luna. She had positioned herself neatly beside him, her tiny frame barely making a dent in the mattress. Unlike Max, who radiated warmth and comfort, Luna was cool and composed, her tail flicking slightly even in sleep. A soft chuckle escaped James as he lay there, watching them. It was a new feeling, having someone there, filling the space around him. He had spent so long getting used to the silence that this quiet presence felt like something entirely new. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of loneliness pressing against his chest. But as much as James wanted to hold on to this peaceful moment, life had a way of reminding him that change was never easy. The morning started smoothly enough. James poured kibble into Max's bowl and opened a can of tuna for Luna. Max immediately began eating, his tail wagging in delight as if he had never tasted anything so delicious. Luna, on the other hand, sniffed her food, then looked up at James with a sharp, disapproving glare. James raised an eyebrow. Not a fan of tuna? Luna let out a quiet, unimpressed meow before turning away, flicking her tail as if insulted by the offering. Max, ever the opportunist, took this as an invitation and eagerly stepped toward Luna's untouched bowl. Bad idea. With a sudden, swift motion, Luna lashed out, her claws stopping just inches from Max's nose. The golden retriever stumbled back, startled, ears flattening against his head. Luna, satisfied that her point had been made, lifted her chin high and sauntered away, her tail swaying like a queen who had just disciplined a foolish subject. James sighed. Well, this might take some work. Max was a creature of boundless energy, constantly wagging his tail, following James wherever he went, always eager to please. He found joy in the simplest things, a belly rub, a game of fetch, or simply lying at James' feet as he read a book. Luna, however, was different. She was quiet, watchful, calculating. She didn't rush to greet James when he came home, nor did she demand attention like Max did. She had a certain air of mystery, observing everything with sharp, knowing eyes, as if she understood the world far better than anyone else. And, perhaps most importantly, she was not particularly fond of Max. It wasn't that she outright hated him, she just didn't trust him. Max, in all his clumsy enthusiasm, wanted so badly to be friends. He tried everything, bringing her his favorite chew toy, wagging his tail excitedly whenever she entered the room, even attempting to share his spot on the couch. But every attempt was met with the same response, an unamused stare, an elegant turn of her head, and a flick of her tail as she walked away. One afternoon, James sat at his desk, working on some paperwork, when a sudden crash echoed through the house. His heart leapt. Rushing into the living room, he found Max standing in the middle of the mess, his tail tucked between his legs, ears drooping. Beside him, the shattered remains of James' favorite lamp lay scattered across the floor. And perched on the windowsill, watching the scene unfold with what could only be described as mild amusement, was Luna. James sighed, rubbing his temple. "Max, buddy. What happened?" The golden retriever lowered his head in guilt, his big brown eyes practically begging for forgiveness. James looked from Max to Luna, and suddenly, he understood. Max had been trying to climb onto the couch, Luna's favorite spot. She, not wanting to share, had likely swiped at him, causing him to jump back in surprise and knock over the lamp in the process. James exhaled slowly. "All right, I get it. You two need space." Luna gave him a slow blink, whether it was an apology or simply an acknowledgement of his understanding, James wasn't sure. Max, still looking guilty, carefully approached James and nudged his hand. James smiled, kneeling to scratch behind his ears. "It's okay, boy. We'll figure this out." But deep down, he couldn't help but worry, what if they never got along? Days passed, and the tension remained. Luna claimed the high places, the bookshelves, the windowsill, the back of the couch, watching Max from above like a queen overseeing her kingdom. Max, on the other hand, continued his hopeless attempts at friendship, only to be met with rejection each time. James tried to help. He set up separate feeding areas, designated different resting spots, even tried playing with them together. But Luna was stubborn, and Max was clueless. Then, one night, something changed. A storm rolled in, the sky darkening with heavy clouds. The rain came first, pattering softly against the windows. Then the wind picked up, howling through the trees, making the house creak and groan. And finally, the thunder, deep, rumbling, shaking the walls with its power. James was in the kitchen when he heard it, whimpering. He turned to find Max curled up in the corner, his body trembling with every crack of thunder. His usual confidence was gone, replaced with wide, frightened eyes. James' heart ached. "Oh, buddy." He knelt beside him, running a hand through his fur. "It's okay. It's just a storm." But Max didn't move. And then, something unexpected happened. A small, shadowy figure padded into the room. Luna. She didn't jump into James' lap or rub against Max for comfort. No, she simply sat down near him, just close enough that her presence was felt. Her tail curled neatly around her paws, and her green eyes remained steady, unwavering. She wasn't scared. She was watching. And, for the first time, she wasn't looking at Max with irritation or distaste. She was looking at him with understanding. Max, still shaking, turned his head toward her. He watched her for a moment, as if realizing that she wasn't afraid. Slowly, hesitantly, he stopped trembling so much. He took a breath. James held his own breath, watching the silent interaction unfold. Luna didn't say anything, didn't make a move, but her presence alone was enough. She was there. And somehow, that was enough for Max. James smiled softly, warmth spreading through his chest. Maybe, just maybe, they were beginning to understand each other. The next morning, when James woke up, something had changed. Max still lay at his feet, but this time, he wasn't alone. Curled up beside him, just close enough that their fur barely touched, was Luna. James stared for a long moment, a slow smile spreading across his face. The rough start hadn't been easy. They had fought, misunderstood each other, pushed each other away. But now, they were learning. And that was all that mattered. The morning after the storm, James awoke to something unexpected. For the past few days, Max had been sleeping at the foot of the bed while Luna claimed her usual high ground spots, the windowsill, the couch, or sometimes even the top of a bookshelf. She never let Max get too close, always maintaining her distance with a careful, watchful elegance. But today was different. As James blinked against the soft morning light filtering through the curtains, his eyes landed on the two figures curled up beside each other. Max lay on his side, his golden fur slightly ruffled, his breathing slow and steady. And right next to him, close enough that their fur almost blended together, was Luna. She was curled up in her usual poised manner, her tail wrapped neatly around her body. At first glance, she still seemed distant, as if the moment was entirely coincidental. But James noticed something subtle. Her ears weren't perked in alertness, nor was she watching Max with her usual judgmental stare. Instead, she was at ease, resting. James held back a smile, afraid to break the fragile peace between them. He didn't want to ruin whatever progress had been made overnight. As quietly as possible, he slipped out of bed, leaving them undisturbed. He moved through his morning routine, making coffee, filling their food bowls, and preparing for the day. But in the back of his mind, he kept glancing toward the bedroom, half expecting to hear the usual scuffle between Max's boundless energy and Luna's sharp disapproval. Yet, when he peeked inside again, they were still lying there. Something had shifted. As the morning passed, James watched their interactions closely. Max, still overly eager, kept trying to play with Luna, but this time, she didn't immediately reject him. Instead of her usual hissing or swiping, she simply gave him a look, a slow, steady gaze that held more authority than any physical reaction ever could. And, to James' surprise, Max seemed to understand. He backed off. Not completely, he was still Max, after all, but it was the first time he had exercised restraint around her. Instead of leaping toward her with unfiltered excitement, he wagged his tail and waited, hoping she would come to him. She didn't. But she didn't run away either. James smiled. Small victories. Later that afternoon, James sat on the couch, reading a book. Max lay on the floor nearby, chewing lazily on one of his toys. Luna, as usual, had claimed the top of the couch, stretched out like royalty surveying her kingdom. James had grown used to this arrangement, two separate worlds coexisting under one roof. But today, something unexpected happened. Luna stretched, extended her claws slightly into the fabric, and then, without warning, jumped down. She didn't go far. Just a few steps. Close enough that she was now on the same level as Max. James barely dared to breathe. Max lifted his head, ears perking up in interest. His tail thumped against the floor, but he didn't move, as if sensing that any sudden action might ruin the moment. Luna took another step. Then another. And then, she sat. Just a foot away from Max. It wasn't an invitation for play, nor was it an admission of trust. But it was something. A silent agreement. A tentative acceptance that his presence wasn't entirely unbearable. Max, clearly thrilled, still managed to contain himself. He let out a low, happy whine and gently wagged his tail, careful not to disturb her. James set his book down, watching them with quiet amazement. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a dramatic breakthrough. But it was a beginning. The first playful moment, later that evening, as James was cooking dinner, he heard a strange noise from the living room. At first, he thought Max had knocked something over again, but when he peeked around the corner, he saw something that nearly made him drop the spoon in his hand. Luna, elegant, composed, independent Luna, was swiping at Max's tail. Not in annoyance. Not in anger. But in play. It was hesitant, awkward, as if she wasn't entirely sure how to do it. She would extend a paw, tap his tail as it wagged, and then quickly pull back, her green eyes flickering with something between curiosity and amusement. Max, utterly delighted, froze in place, as if too scared to ruin the moment. His tail twitched, and when Luna swiped at it again, he let out a soft, excited bark. Luna flinched at the noise but didn't leave. Instead, she let out a short, quiet meow, more of a warning than a protest. James watched, utterly mesmerized. Max, learning from his past mistakes, lowered his head slightly, wagging his tail at a slower, more careful pace. Luna's ears twitched. And then, she swiped again. A tiny, hesitant game had begun. It only lasted a few moments. Luna, ever the mysterious one, eventually turned and walked away, flicking her tail as if dismissing the interaction altogether. But James knew what he had seen. A connection was forming. A slow, fragile thread of understanding. The first shared meal, the next day, James made a small change. Normally, he fed Max and Luna in separate areas, knowing that Luna was far too territorial to share space with the enthusiastic golden retriever. But today, he decided to take a risk. He placed their bowls just a little closer than usual. Not side by side, but within the same space, just enough that they would have to acknowledge each other's presence. Max, as always, ran toward his food without hesitation. Luna, however, hesitated. She glanced at James, then at Max, then at the bowl. A long moment passed. Then, she took a step forward. And another. She reached her bowl, tail high, her body tense with awareness of the dog beside her. Max, to his credit, didn't invade her space. He simply ate, content and peaceful, occasionally glancing at her but never pushing his luck. And for the first time since they had arrived in James' home, they ate together. Side by side. Not as enemies. Not even just as housemates. But as something closer to friends. James felt his chest tighten with emotion. This house had been so quiet for so long. Too long. But now, it was alive. It was filled with soft sounds, the clicking of nails on the floor, the gentle thud of paws landing from furniture, the occasional rustle of fur as one brushed past the other. And the loneliness that had once suffocated these walls? It was fading. The beginning of something beautiful. That night, as James settled into bed, he felt a familiar warmth near his feet. Max. But then, another small weight pressed against his side. Luna. She wasn't curled up next to Max like she had been the night before, but she wasn't far either. Close enough that, if she wanted to, she could reach out and touch him. James let out a deep, contented sigh, reaching down to scratch Max's head and give Luna a gentle rub behind her ears. Two souls, one boundlessly loving, the other fiercely independent, had found a way to exist together. And in the quiet darkness of the room, with the steady rhythm of their breathing filling the space, James smiled. Because for the first time in years, this house was no longer just a house. It was a home. The fragile truce between Max and Luna was holding, but trust was still a delicate thing, something built slowly, piece by piece, with patience and time. James had started noticing the little moments that spoke of progress. The way Luna no longer bristled when Max walked past her. The way Max had learned to approach her with careful, measured steps rather than bounding excitement. These moments were subtle, easy to miss, but they carried the weight of something important. A bond was forming. Not a perfect one. Not yet. But something real. The hesitant touch. One evening, as James sat on the couch reading, he felt Max shift beside him. The golden retriever was sprawled out comfortably, his head resting on James' lap, eyes half-lidded in contentment. On the other side of the couch, curled up like a regal queen, was Luna. She had long since claimed the highest and softest spots in the house, but lately, she had been inching closer, never too close, never touching, but closer. Tonight, however, something was different. Max shifted slightly in his sleep, and as he did, his fluffy tail flicked over Luna's paws. James tensed, fully expecting Luna to react. A hiss, a swat, something. But she didn't. Instead, she simply looked at the tail resting on her paws, her green eyes flickering with something unreadable. Slowly, carefully, she lifted a single paw and placed it on the golden fur. It wasn't an act of dominance. It wasn't a threat. It was simply a moment. A silent experiment, as if she were testing the feel of trust. James held his breath. Max, still half asleep, let out a soft sigh and didn't move. Luna remained still for a few seconds longer, then just as quietly, withdrew her paw. James smiled. It wasn't much, but it was something. A step forward. Braving the outdoors, the real test of trust came a few days later. James had always taken Max out for walks, long ones through the park, where the dog could run free and burn off his endless energy. Luna, on the other hand, had never shown interest in leaving the house. The outside world, to her, was unnecessary. But one afternoon, as James clipped Max's leash and opened the door, Luna sat by the entrance, watching. Her tail flicked. Her ears perked. Something about the open door fascinated her. James crouched down, gently scratching behind her ears. "You want to come, girl?" She gave him a slow blink, considering. For a moment, James thought she would turn away. But then, to his utter surprise, she took a single step forward. James felt his heart leap. Was she actually willing to try? He didn't push her. Didn't pick her up or force her outside. He simply let her decide. Luna hesitated at the threshold, her paws barely touching the wooden porch. The breeze ruffled her fur, and she took a long, slow breath, her green eyes scanning the unfamiliar world beyond the door. Max, already outside, turned and let out a happy bark. That was enough to break the spell. Luna immediately pulled back, shooting Max a glare before flicking her tail and striding away as if she had never intended to leave in the first place. James chuckled. Maybe next time. And yet, as he walked away with Max, he couldn't help but feel hopeful. Luna had considered it. She had taken a step. That, in itself, was a victory. The real breakthrough came on an otherwise ordinary evening. James had been working in his home office when a sudden loud bang echoed through the house. A storm had arrived, and the wind had slammed a loose window shut. Max barked in surprise, his fur bristling. Luna, however, had the strongest reaction. She bolted. James barely caught sight of her as she dashed out of the room, her claws skidding against the floor in her panic. He immediately stood up, his heart pounding with worry. "Luna?" he called gently, stepping into the living room. "Nothing." Max whined, sniffing the air. He, too, seemed to sense something was wrong. James searched everywhere, under the couch, behind bookshelves, in every hiding spot he could think of. But Luna was nowhere to be found. Then, Max did something unexpected. Instead of his usual excitement, he moved cautiously, sniffing along the walls, his body low to the ground. He was searching. Helping. James followed him into the hallway, where the coat closet stood slightly ajar. Max stopped, let out a soft whimper, and nudged the door open with his nose. And there, curled in the farthest corner, trembling, was Luna. Jameis' heart ached at the sight. She had always been independent, always too proud to show fear. But now, in this moment, she was small. Vulnerable. And yet, she wasn't alone. Max took a slow step forward and lay down at the entrance of the closet. He didn't move closer. Didn't force himself into her space. He just waited. Luna's wide green eyes flickered toward him. Slowly, hesitantly, her ears lowered. And then, in a moment that made Jameis' chest tighten, she scooted closer, just an inch, but close enough that their fur touched. Max let out a deep, comforting sigh and rested his head on his paws. James knelt down, speaking softly. "Hey, sweetheart. It's okay. I'm here." Luna didn't flinch when he reached out. For the first time since she had come into his home, she leaned into his touch. And in that moment, James knew, she trusted him. She trusted both of them. The beginning of a true family. That night, as the storm continued outside, James sat on the couch with Max at his side. Luna, for the first time, didn't take her usual spot high above them. Instead, she settled right next to Max. It wasn't a dramatic, affectionate cuddle like one might expect from a dog and cat duo in movies. But it was real. She was there. Choosing to be close. Max, ever gentle, turned his head slightly and gave her a single, soft lick on the ear. Luna twitched but didn't move away. James felt his chest warm with something deep and powerful. This wasn't just a house anymore. It was a home. A real, beating, living home filled with trust, love, and the slow, steady growth of something unbreakable. And as he watched his once lonely cat and his ever-loving dog finally share the same space, finally find a way to exist together, James smiled. Because he knew, they weren't just pets anymore. They were family. The quiet transformation of their home had begun. What was once a place of solitude now echoed with the warmth of companionship. The days of uncertainty between Max and Luna were fading, replaced by something far more profound, an understanding beyond words, a bond that was forming in the spaces between silence and shared moments. James could feel it. The tension that once crackled in the air when Luna and Max were in the same room had softened. Their movements were no longer carefully measured around each other. They had stopped treating each other as an obstacle and started acknowledging each other as something more. It was happening in the smallest, most beautiful ways. The way Luna no longer fled the room when Max entered. The way Max slowed his excited tail wags when he walked past Luna, as if he had learned that sudden movements startled her. The way their eyes met, not in a challenge, but in quiet recognition. A bond was forming. And it was real. Unspoken rituals of companionship. James had noticed something fascinating. Max and Luna had developed their own unspoken routines. Every morning, Max would wake up first. He had always been an early riser, bounding to James' bed and nudging him awake for their morning walk. But now, there was an extra step in his routine. Before heading toward James, Max would pause at the couch, where Luna lay curled in a tight ball, her tail wrapped delicately around her body. He would sniff the air, ears perking slightly, and then, ever so gently, he would lower his head and let out a soft breath near her. A greeting. Not an intrusive one, not an excited bark or playful nudge, just a soft, warm puff of air, an acknowledgement of her presence. And every morning, Luna responded. She didn't jump or bristle anymore. Instead, she would twitch her ears, flick her tail just once, and let out a soft exhale of her own. It was their silent exchange, their own way of saying, "Good morning." It wasn't affection in the traditional sense. Luna wasn't the kind to rub against Max or seek his warmth. But this? This was trust. James saw it happen day after day, and every time, his heart swelled with quiet joy. The cold night that changed everything, one evening, a sharp chill settled over the town. The heating system in James' home was working fine, but there was something about that particular night, the way the air felt, the biting cold against the windows, that made everything feel just a little too quiet, a little too empty. James sat curled up on the couch with a book in hand, Max snuggled against him. The golden retriever was a natural heater, his thick fur radiating warmth. Luna, as always, had taken her spot at the far end of the couch, perched delicately like a queen surveying her kingdom. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, the cold was different. James glanced at Luna, watching as she shifted uncomfortably, her fur puffed out slightly. She was cold. He considered getting up, grabbing an extra blanket for her, but before he could move, Max did something unexpected. He got up, moved toward her. And then, without hesitation, he curled up right next to her. James held his breath. Luna's ears twitched, and for a moment, she looked almost offended at the sudden proximity. Her green eyes flicked toward Max, as if debating whether to swat him away. But then, slowly, hesitantly, she shifted. She didn't move away. Instead, she stretched ever so slightly, adjusting her position so that the warmth of Max's fur reached her paws. And just like that, she accepted him. James felt something in his chest tighten. They weren't just tolerating each other anymore. They weren't just learning to coexist. They were beginning to need each other. The playful chase. If there was one thing James had been sure of, it was that Max was playful and Luna was not. Or at least, that's what he had thought. Because one evening, as James prepared dinner, he heard something unexpected, the unmistakable sound of paws skidding across the floor. At first, he assumed it was just Max being his usual excitable self, maybe chasing his tail or pouncing on a toy. But when he turned around, he saw Luna. And she was running. Not away in fear. Not in frustration. She was playing. Max, wide-eyed with excitement, was trotting after her, not lunging, not overwhelming her, but matching her pace, letting her set the rules of the game. And Luna? Luna's tail was high, her movements quick and graceful as she dashed under the table, then darted back out, her green eyes gleaming with something James had never seen in her before. Joy. She was teasing Max, leading him on a chase through the living room, weaving through furniture with the kind of effortless agility only a cat could manage. Max, though larger and clumsier, followed her lead, playfully bouncing after her with his tongue lolling in excitement. James stood frozen, watching in awe. They were playing together. Not enemies. Not rivals. Not just two animals sharing the same space. They were companions. James let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For the first time since bringing Luna home, he felt something settle deep within him. He had worried so much. Wondered if he had done the right thing. Wondered if they would ever truly accept each other. But watching them now, watching the way Max held back just enough to let Luna win, the way Luna looked back to make sure Max was still following, he knew. He knew they had found something special. Something rare. Something beautiful. An unbreakable bond. That night, James sat on the couch, watching his once lonely dog and his once guarded cat settle beside each other. It was different now. Luna didn't keep her distance. Max didn't hesitate. They simply were. Together. And James knew, in that quiet, heartwarming moment, they weren't just pets anymore. They were family. The house had become a true home. Max and Luna, once wary strangers, had found something precious, an unspoken companionship, a rhythm of trust. Their bond had been built in small moments, in stolen glances, in playful chases and quiet warmth. But trust, as James knew, wasn't just about peace. It was about standing together when everything fell apart. And on one fateful night, their bond would be tested in a way no one could have predicted. The unseen danger. The day had started like any other. A calm morning, a peaceful afternoon, and a cozy evening spent lounging in the living room. James had been reading on the couch, Max sprawled beside him, and Luna perched elegantly on the windowsill, watching the world outside. But then, the storm came. It wasn't just a drizzle or a passing rain. It was a monster. The wind howled like a beast in the night, shaking the house with each furious gust. The rain lashed against the windows, a relentless drumbeat that filled the air with unease. Thunder rumbled in the distance, deep and menacing, and with each crack of lightning, the house was bathed in ghostly flashes of light. James immediately felt the shift in energy. Max, his ever-brave golden retriever, sat up, ears pinned back. His tail, usually a source of endless wagging joy, was still, his body tense. He wasn't outright scared, but he was alert. Luna, on the other hand, had gone rigid on the windowsill. Her green eyes were wide, her fur bristling. Her tail flicked anxiously, and James knew she was debating whether to flee to her usual hiding spots. "Hey, it's okay," James said gently, trying to soothe them both. But the storm had other plans. Without warning, the power went out. Darkness swallowed the house in an instant. A deafening clap of thunder followed, shaking the walls. And that was all it took for Luna to panic. She leapt down from the windowsill, claws scrambling against the wooden floor as she bolted toward the hallway. "Luna!" James called, his voice edged with worry. Max immediately sprang into action. He didn't hesitate. He didn't think. He ran after her. The search in the darkness. James grabbed his phone, using the dim glow of the screen to navigate through the darkened house. His heart pounded. He knew Luna. He knew her fear. When she panicked, she didn't just hide, she disappeared. Max's worried whimpers echoed from somewhere in the house. James followed the sound, his breath catching as he entered the hallway. The back door was open. His stomach dropped. The wind had forced it ajar. And Luna, frightened, desperate to escape the thunder, was gone. Max's loyalty. James didn't think. He acted. He threw on a jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped into the storm. The rain was relentless, soaking him within seconds. The wind roared, pushing against him with unseen hands. "Luna!" he called into the night. Max barked beside him, his fur drenched but his spirit unwavering. His ears were up, his nose sniffing frantically. James had never seen Max like this before. Determined. Focused. Protective. Luna wasn't just another animal to him. She was his. His family. And he was going to find her. They searched everywhere, the backyard, the side of the house, the bushes that lined the fence. James' flashlight flickered through the darkness, his heart hammering with every second that passed. Then, a sound. A faint, terrified meow. James turned toward it, his breath catching. Luna. But she wasn't alone. She had somehow climbed onto the wooden fence, but the storm had made it slippery. Her claws desperately gripped the surface, her body trembling. The wind battered against her, threatening to knock her down. James' stomach twisted. If she fell, she could get hurt, or worse, she could bolt even farther away. And then, Max moved. Before James could stop him, Max leapt toward the fence, his paws landing on the base. He didn't bark. He didn't startle her. Instead, he simply looked up at her. His big brown eyes, full of something powerful. Something steady. Something that said, "I'm here. I won't let you fall." Luna's terrified eyes locked onto his. For a single, frozen moment, trust hung in the air. Then, inch by inch, she began to move. Her claws slipped, but Max stayed firm beneath her, ready to catch her if she fell. James held his breath, stepping forward, arms outstretched. "Come on, sweetheart," he whispered. "You're almost there." Luna let out a tiny, pitiful meow, and then she jumped straight into James' waiting arms. James held her close, feeling her small body tremble against him. He could feel her racing heartbeat, the sheer terror that had gripped her moments ago. But she was safe now. She was home. Max wagged his tail, stepping closer to nuzzle her. And to James' complete and utter shock, Luna didn't pull away. She didn't hiss. She didn't flee. Instead, she leaned into Max's warmth. Not because she was too weak to move, but because she didn't want to. For the first time, she let herself need him. James let out a breath, pressing a gentle kiss to Luna's damp fur. "Let's go home." Back inside, James wrapped Luna in a warm towel, drying her off as she nestled against his chest. Max sat beside them, ever the guardian, his tail thumping gently. The storm still raged outside, but inside their home, there was only peace. Luna didn't return to her high perch that night. Instead, she curled up right next to Max, her small frame pressed against his side. And Max? He rested his head next to her, letting out a long, content sigh. James watched them, his heart swelling. It had happened. Through fear, through trust, through the silent moments of understanding, they had become family. Not just housemates. Not just two animals living under the same roof. Real family. And in the warmth of that moment, as the storm raged on outside, James knew they would never be alone again. The storm had passed. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow over the home that had once been lonely and silent. But today, it wasn't just a house. It was a sanctuary. A place of warmth, love, and quiet understanding. James stretched as he woke, his body still heavy with exhaustion from the night before. His mind replayed the frantic search in the storm, the fear, the desperation, and finally, the relief of having Luna safe in his arms. He turned his head, expecting to see Max at the foot of his bed like always. But what he saw instead made his heart swell. Luna was there too. For the first time ever, she had not retreated to her usual solitary spot. Instead, she lay curled up beside Max, her tiny body pressed against his golden fur. And Max, ever the protector, had draped his tail over her like a shield. James swallowed hard, emotion tightening his chest. Last night had changed everything. They weren't just bonded by routine anymore. They were bonded by trust. By love. A gentle morning, James moved carefully as he got out of bed, not wanting to disturb the two who had clearly found comfort in each other. He walked into the kitchen, putting on a fresh pot of coffee, but his mind was still on the scene he had just witnessed. Could it really be that simple? Had one terrifying night been enough to break down the last walls between them? He didn't have to wait long to find out. As soon as Max woke up, he stretched lazily, yawning as he trotted into the kitchen like he always did. But instead of bounding over to James like usual, he stopped at the bedroom doorway. And he waited. James frowned slightly, following Max's gaze. Luna was still curled up on the bed. Max wagged his tail once, then let out a soft, low whimper, not impatient, not demanding. Just an invitation. And then, to James' absolute astonishment, Luna stood up. She stretched slowly, then padded toward Max on delicate paws. For a brief second, she hesitated, her instinct still telling her to keep her distance. But then, she made a choice. She brushed against him. It was the lightest, smallest movement. Barely there at all. But to James, it was the most beautiful thing in the world. From that day forward, everything was different. Not in drastic ways, Max and Luna didn't suddenly become inseparable, nor did they lose the unique parts of their personalities. But the change was there, in all the little things. The way Max waited for Luna before running outside. The way Luna no longer flinched and Max's tail accidentally swiped against her. The way Max sometimes nudged a piece of food toward Luna, and she didn't reject it outright. The way Luna, on rare but precious occasions, would reach out a paw and gently touch Max's nose. They were learning each other's language. Not the language of words, nor even of shared instincts. One evening, as James sat on the couch, he watched his two companions settle down together. Max, ever the affectionate one, curled up in his usual spot. Luna, still hesitant in her own ways, took her place a small distance away, but not as far as before. She watched Max with quiet curiosity. And then, slowly, cautiously, she shifted forward, just a few inches. And then a few more. Until finally, she was close enough to rest her tiny head against his back. James felt something deep inside him break. A wave of pure, unfiltered love washed over him. Because he saw it now. This wasn't just a bond between a dog and a cat. It wasn't just about getting used to each other's presence. It was something deeper. Max had learned patience. Luna had learned trust. And James? He had learned the power of love, the kind that heals even the deepest loneliness. His home was no longer quiet in the way it used to be. It was full. It was whole. And as he watched Max and Luna drift into sleep, side by side, he knew, they would never be alone again. The days following the storm felt different. Not in a way that was loud or obvious, there were no dramatic changes, no sudden bursts of affection between Max and Luna. But something had shifted. Something real. A quiet understanding had settled between them. Max no longer chased Luna as if she were prey. He still wagged his tail eagerly when she walked by, but now, instead of flinching, Luna would simply watch him with calm, assessing eyes. And more often than not, she would stay. She didn't always run anymore. She didn't always hide. Because she had started to believe something she never thought possible. She was safe. She was wanted. She belonged. The first real sign of change came one lazy afternoon. James was sitting on the couch, flipping through a book while Max snoozed beside him. The golden retriever had his head resting on James' leg, his slow, steady breathing filling the room with warmth. Luna sat by the window, as she often did, watching the outside world with quiet curiosity. But this time, something was different. Instead of staying there all day, alone in her little corner, she turned. And, hesitantly, she moved toward Max. James held his breath, his fingers frozen on the page of his book. Max opened one sleepy eye as Luna approached. He didn't move, didn't startle her. He just let her come to him on her own terms. She paused just a few inches away, as if debating whether to go through with it. Then, after a long, thoughtful moment, she lay down. Not too close. Not pressed up against him. But near enough. Near enough that, if Max stretched just a little, their fur might brush against each other. James felt something tighten in his throat. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't dramatic. But it was everything. Because for Luna, trust had never come easily. And now, here she was. Choosing to stay. A new routine. From that day on, small changes kept appearing. Little, precious moments that showed just how much Max and Luna had grown to accept each other. Luna, once territorial over her food, no longer hissed if Max got too close. She still liked her space, but when Max finished his meal and turned toward her, she simply flicked her tail instead of retreating. Max had always been a sprawled-out, belly-up kind of sleeper. Luna preferred curled-up corners. But now? She started choosing spots closer to him. She never curled into his fur, not yet, but she always made sure she was near. Playtime. Max, ever the playful one, had long accepted that Luna wasn't interested in his antics. But one evening, as he rolled around with one of his favorite chew toys, something unexpected happened. Luna swiped at it. Not aggressively. Not in annoyance, playfully. Max froze, his ears perking up in excitement. His tail started wagging, but he kept himself still, waiting to see if she would do it again. And she did. Just once more, her tiny paw reaching out, tapping the toy with careful curiosity. James watched from across the room, barely able to contain his smile. It wasn't much. But for Luna, it was everything. She was learning. Learning that love didn't have to be loud. That companionship didn't have to be forced. That trust could be built one small moment at a time. One night, as James sat on the couch, sipping his tea and watching Max and Luna settle in for bed, something happened that made his heart stop. Max was already curled up in his usual spot, his golden fur a warm, familiar presence. Luna was a few feet away, tucked into her own cozy corner. Then, in the soft stillness of the night, she moved. Slowly. Cautiously. She padded across the floor, past her usual resting spot, toward the sleeping form of Max. James sat frozen, barely daring to breathe. Max stirred slightly, lifting his head just as Luna reached him. His sleepy brown eyes blinked in confusion as he watched her. And then, she lay down. Right beside him. Not near him. Not close, but with space in between. Beside him. Her tiny body, delicate and warm, pressed gently against his golden fur. Max stilled. His tail gave a slow, gentle wag. And then, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along, he rested his head beside her. A quiet sigh of contentment filled the air. Luna, for once, didn't move away. She didn't flinch. She simply closed her eyes, trusting him with all that she was. James felt something deep in his heart crack wide open. Because he understood what this meant. For Luna, this was love. Not in grand gestures. Not in loud affection. But in the quiet, simple choice of togetherness. She had let him in. She had let both of them in. And as James sat there, watching the two souls who had once been so different now curled up as one, he knew. They weren't just pets. They weren't just housemates. They were family. Forever. The transformation in their home had been slow but undeniable. What was once a house of solitude had turned into a home of quiet companionship. The fragile bonds between James, Max, and Luna had strengthened, built not on force or expectation, but on understanding, patience, and love. But love, as James had come to learn, wasn't just about warmth and comfort. Love was about protection. And soon, Max and Luna would prove just how deeply that love ran. One cold evening, as the wind howled outside, James sat on the couch with a blanket draped over his shoulders. Max lay at his feet, lazily gnawing on one of his toys, while Luna sat perched on the windowsill, her keen eyes scanning the darkness outside. She was always watchful. Always cautious. It was just who she was. But tonight, James noticed something different. Her ears were perked up higher than usual. Her tail flicked, not in annoyance, but in nervous anticipation. James frowned, setting down his cup of tea. "What is it, girl?" he murmured, following her gaze toward the dimly lit street outside. At first, he saw nothing. But then, a shadow moved. James sat up straighter, his senses suddenly on high alert. The figure outside was too far away to make out clearly, but there was something unsettling about it. Something wrong. And then, Max growled. A deep, low sound rumbled from his throat, the kind he rarely made unless something truly bothered him. He lifted his head, his body stiffening as his ears perked toward the door. James' pulse quickened. Max was protective, but he wasn't the type to growl unless there was a reason. And now, both Max and Luna were focused on the same thing. Something, or someone, was out there. James stood, moving carefully toward the window for a better look. He pulled back the curtain slightly, just enough to see outside. The figure was closer now. Too close. A man stood near the front of the house, lingering by the gate. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there. Watching. Something about it made James' skin crawl. Max stood up, his hackles raised. A deep, protective growl built in his chest as he took a step toward the door, placing himself between James and whatever was outside. But then, something surprising happened. Luna, small, delicate Luna, jumped down from the windowsill and stood beside Max. Her body was tense, her ears flattened against her head. She wasn't growling, but her fur bristled with silent defiance. James had never seen her like this before. She had always been cautious, always careful. But right now? Right now, she was ready to fight. For him. For Max. For the home they had built together. James' heart pounded as he glanced between his two companions. They weren't just reacting out of instinct. They were protecting him. The realization sent a wave of emotion crashing through him. Max let out another deep, warning growl, his stance firm and unyielding. Luna, despite her small size, hissed, a sharp, dangerous sound that sent a clear message. This is our home. Leave. And then, as if he had felt their unwavering presence, the man outside moved. He took a step back. Then another. And then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the night. James let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He stepped forward and gently placed his hands on both Max and Luna. You guys. His voice wavered with emotion. You knew, didn't you? Max wagged his tail once but kept his gaze on the door, still on guard. Luna, her body still tense, blinked up at James with fierce determination. It was in that moment that James truly understood. They weren't just pets. They weren't just companions. They were his protectors. And he was theirs. Forever. The night of the stranger had changed something in James. Not in a way that could be seen, not in the way he went about his daily life, nor in the way he fed or cared for Max and Luna. But deep in his heart, something had settled. Something he had always known but never quite understood until now. Max and Luna weren't just pets. They were family. And family meant everything. The next morning, James awoke with a newfound appreciation for the warmth in his home. The fear from the previous night had faded, but what remained was something far more powerful: gratitude. Gratitude for Max, who had stood between him and danger without hesitation. Gratitude for Luna, who, despite her small frame and cautious nature, had shown the heart of a lioness. And gratitude for the love that had grown between all three of them, a love stronger than words. As James stretched and climbed out of bed, Max was already waiting for him, wagging his tail excitedly. "Morning, bud," James murmured, rubbing his golden fur. Luna was perched on the windowsill, her watchful eyes scanning the outside world. Even now, she was still protecting them. James chuckled softly. "You're still keeping guard, huh?" She flicked her tail but didn't move. And for the first time, James truly understood what she was saying. She wasn't just looking out for herself anymore. She was looking out for them. An unspoken promise. The day passed as usual, meals were shared, walks were taken, and quiet moments of companionship filled the space between them. But there was something new now. Something deeper. When James sat on the couch, Max no longer just lay beside him, he lay pressed against him. As if making sure he was always close. When Luna sat on the armrest, she no longer kept her usual distance, she sat right next to him, her tail resting lightly on his shoulder. And when night fell, neither of them chose to sleep alone. Luna, for the first time ever, crawled onto James' bed. She didn't curl up at the farthest corner like he expected. Instead, she settled between him and Max. Right in the middle. As if she had finally decided, this was where she belonged. James swallowed past the lump in his throat and reached out carefully, gently stroking her fur. She didn't pull away. She didn't tense. She just let him. Max, sensing the quiet moment, nudged his nose against James' side before letting out a contented sigh. In that small, precious moment, everything felt right. James closed his eyes, his heart swelling with something so deep, so profound, it was almost overwhelming. He wasn't alone anymore. And he never would be again. They didn't need to say it. Not in words, not in grand gestures. It was in the way Luna watched over them from the windowsill, always making sure they were safe. It was in the way Max pressed himself against James during every storm, protecting him as much as James protected them. It was in the way they simply existed together, not as three separate souls, but as one. A man. A dog. A cat. A family. And that was all that mattered. The seasons changed. Spring melted into summer, summer cooled into autumn, and autumn gave way to winter's soft embrace. Through it all, Max, Luna, and James grew even closer. Not just in the way they lived together, but in the way they understood each other, without words, without explanations. Max's tail wags, Luna's careful blinks, James' quiet gestures, all of it had become a language of its own. A language of love, trust, and belonging. But life, as James had learned the hard way, was never just about the good moments. There were storms ahead. And when they came, they would have to face them together. It started with something small. Max was usually full of energy, bounding around the house, eager for his walks, always ready to play. But one morning, he didn't get up as quickly as usual. When James called his name, Max lifted his head, his tail wagging faintly, but he didn't stand. James frowned. "You okay, bud?" Max gave a soft huff, as if to say yes, but... James knelt beside him, running his fingers through the golden fur he knew so well. Max's body was warm, too warm. Something was wrong. Luna, who had been watching from her usual spot, suddenly jumped down and padded over. She sniffed at Max, nudging his side with her nose. He barely reacted. James' heart pounded. Max wasn't the type to complain. If he wasn't moving, if he wasn't eating, if he wasn't playing, something was very wrong. And the fear that gripped James in that moment was unlike anything he had ever felt before. The vet's office was quiet, but inside, James' mind was anything but. He sat in the waiting room, his hands gripping each other tightly. Luna was at home, but he could almost feel her worry too. Max lay beside him on the floor, his head resting on James' shoe. He had always been the strong one, the protector. But now, he was the one who needed help. James ran his fingers through Max's fur. "You're gonna be okay, buddy. I promise." He didn't know if he was saying it for Max or for himself. After what felt like forever, the vet returned. "Max has a fever and some joint inflammation," she said gently. "It could be an infection, or it could just be his age catching up with him. We'll need to monitor him, but with the right medication and rest, he should recover." Relief crashed over James like a wave. "Thank you," he breathed, his eyes stinging. Max gave a small, tired wag of his tail. They weren't out of the woods yet, but at least now, there was hope. Luna's silent watch back home, Luna was waiting. She was sitting by the door when James carried Max inside. She didn't hiss. She didn't retreat. She simply watched. And then, she followed. Max was too tired to move much, settling onto his favorite spot by the couch. James sat beside him, gently stroking his fur, whispering reassurances. And Luna? She curled up just a few inches away. She didn't touch him, not yet. But she stayed. And for her, that was the greatest comfort she could give. James noticed. And so did Max. Despite his exhaustion, his tail gave one small, grateful wag. He knew. She was watching over him. A family's strength. The days passed in slow recovery. Max grew stronger. His energy returned little by little, his appetite improving, his spirit unshaken. And through it all, Luna never left his side. If Max was sleeping, she was near. If Max was drinking water, she sat close, watching protectively. James had never seen anything like it. The cat who once feared him, who once flinched at Max's excitement, was now his quiet guardian. She didn't need to fight. She didn't need to bark or growl or stand in the way. She protected in her own way. And Max, in turn, accepted it. James smiled to himself, his heart full. They had come so far. Through loneliness, through storms, through fear and uncertainty. Through everything. And now? They were stronger than ever. Because love wasn't just about the easy moments. Love was about staying, even when it was hard. Even when things seemed uncertain. Even when life knocked them down. They would always get back up. Together. The years passed, as they always do. Seasons changed, time moved forward, and life continued in its quiet, steady rhythm. But some things never changed. The bond between James, Max, and Luna only grew stronger, woven together by shared moments, silent understanding, and a love so deep it needed no words. They had faced challenges together. They had protected each other. And most importantly, they had chosen each other, every single day. But life, as beautiful as it was not infinite. And James knew that some goodbyes could not be avoided. It was a cold autumn morning when James first noticed the change in Max. His once boundless energy had slowed. His steps were softer, his breaths a little heavier. He still wagged his tail, still looked up at James with the same love and trust as always. But James knew. Max was tired. And for the first time, James felt a deep, aching fear settle in his chest. Not yet, he thought. Not yet. But time didn't ask for permission. And neither did fate. One evening, as the sky turned soft with twilight, Max curled up beside James on the couch, just as he always had. Luna was there too, her small body resting quietly near Max's side. It was a moment like any other. Except it wasn't. James could feel it. Max, his protector, his best friend, was slipping away. He wasn't in pain. He wasn't afraid. He was simply at peace. James blinked back tears as he ran his fingers through Max's fur, his voice barely above a whisper. "I love you, buddy," he said. "Thank you. For everything." Max let out a soft sigh, his tail wagging one last time. And then, he was gone. The silence after Max's passing was unlike any silence James had ever known. It wasn't the kind of emptiness he had felt before Max and Luna entered his life. It was something deeper. Something that came from having known great love. And having to say goodbye to it. For days, James struggled to go about his routine without expecting Max to be there, waiting by the door, his eyes bright with excitement for their morning walk. But the hardest part was seeing Luna. She didn't understand why Max wasn't waking up that day. She had curled up beside him, nudging him softly, waiting for him to move. But he never did. Now, she wandered the house, looking for him in the places he used to be. The couch. The doorway. The patch of sunlight on the floor where he used to nap. James saw it in her eyes, the quiet grief, the absence she didn't know how to explain. And for the first time in a long time, James and Luna were alone again. But this time, they had each other. And that meant everything. Time moved forward, as it always does. The sharp pain of loss softened into something gentler, a sadness that lingered, but did not destroy. James and Luna mourned in their own ways. But they also found comfort in each other. Luna, once so distant, now curled up beside James every night. She filled the spaces Max had left, not replacing him, but honoring him. And James? He spoke to her the way he used to talk to Max. And in her quiet way, she answered. They were still a family. Different now, but still whole. Because love doesn't end with loss. It lingers. It stays in the way the heart remembers, in the warmth of old memories, in the quiet understanding between two souls who have been through it all together. And though Max was gone, his love had left something behind, a home that would never be lonely again. One evening, as James sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Luna jumped onto his lap, something she had never done before. She looked up at him, her green eyes reflecting the fading light. James smiled, running his fingers gently through her fur. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the ache of loneliness. Instead, he felt something else. Something Max had taught him. Something Luna had shown him in her own quiet way. Love never fades. Love never truly leaves. And as long as there was love, there would always be family. Always. Forever.